Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Tonneson, and I'd like to start by thanking Jane Albright, the great and wonderful Jane Albright, for inviting me to be part of the virtual To Oz convention. Today's presentation is called Shirley and Oz Connections, Shirley being Shirley Temple, the 1930s child star. And so today's presentation will be Oz adjacent. Growing up, I had twin loves, Oz, and when I say Oz for myself, it was the 1939 MGM classic, and through that, Judy and all things Judy, and Shirley Temple. For Oz, I can't remember a time when Oz was not part of the fabric of my life. In fact, I am absolutely positive that my parents propped me up in front of the television as an infant and as a baby and then as a toddler every time the annual showing came on television. I know, because I remember this, that once I was old enough to read the TV guide, which was my family's Bible, and anticipate the coming of that annual broadcast, that I pretty much planned my life around it, certainly my year around it. The whole family did. It was an event. And millions of people have seen The Wizard of Oz during those broadcasts, during its original release, and then its subsequent re-releases on all the many formats and platforms that we have now. Millions and millions and millions of people. Why is it, and I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, why is it that some of us watch The Wizard of Oz and it seeped into our soul and it became part of the fabric of our lives? Other people watched it, other people like it, other people appreciate it, other people love it. But for them, it was a nice movie and then they moved on with their lives. For us, it became a passion and, dare I say, an obsession. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Well, growing up, my other love was Shirley Temple. And unlike Oz, I do remember when I fell under the Shirley spell. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was flipping the channels, and remember we only had a few at the time, and I came across a Shirley Temple film, The Little Princess. I was familiar with the book. I had just finished reading it. I tuned in, and everything changed. I don't know why, but it was instant, and it was long-lasting. That was the same feeling I have about Oz, and in both cases, I've never looked back. So anytime that Shirley and Oz intersect is always interesting to me, and that's going to be the basis of this presentation today. This presentation will take place in two parts, mostly because I'm not tech savvy enough to merge the two, so please forgive me. This is the introduction, and it's going to be a little bit of show and tell, which I'll do in a moment. But the second part will be a narrated slideshow, a PowerPoint, and I will, at that time, outline most of the connections and in depth that connect, or the reason why we're here, Shirley and the Wizard of Oz. A lot of people think that the biggest Shirley and Oz connection is that Shirley was supposed to be Judy Garland's role. Shirley was supposed to be Dorothy. Well, most of us know that that myth has long been debunked. The powers that be, the producers, Mervyn LeRoy, even Arthur Freed, they always wanted Judy to be Dorothy in the MGM version of The Wizard of Oz. Shirley did know about The Wizard of Oz. I'll talk about that during the presentation. She loved The Wizard of Oz. She'd read all the Oz books. She wanted to not play Dorothy because she thought Dorothy was real. She wrote about this in her 1988 autobiography. She wanted to meet Dorothy. At one point, the people who held the purse strings at MGM were worried about box office, and so they thought that perhaps they should have a name, and Shirley was the name in child stars at the time in 1938. And from what we understand, Roger Edens of MGM did an impromptu or an informal audition of Shirley and saw, like anyone with eyes could see, or certainly with ears, that Shirley could not stand up to Judy vocally. No living person could. And after that, it was Judy and Judy all the way. There was, of course, that apocryphal story about MGM loaning Fox, which was Shirley's home studio, Clark Gable and Jean Harlow in exchange for Shirley's services at MGM. Well, of course, that could not have really happened because in 1937, Jean Harlow died. And at that point, MGM didn't even own the rights to The Wizard of Oz. However, that was a long-standing myth. Shirley herself wrote about it in her autobiography, Child Star. She believed it because that was what the accepted story was at the time. However, Shirley wrote, and we'll talk about this a little bit later during the PowerPoint, that sometimes the gods know best. And what she meant by that was the gods knew that Judy was the one and only Dorothy. And as much as I'm a Shirley Temple fan, I absolutely acknowledge that. Probably the biggest or the best way, the most concrete way that Shirley and Oz connect is through Shirley's television series that she did in the late 50s called Shirley Temple's Storybook. One of the episodes was The Land of Oz, and in it, Shirley played both Ozma and Tip. And I'll talk about that in the PowerPoint presentation as well. But I wanted to mention it because it explains why I'm dressed the way I'm dressed right now. Every year, like the Oz community, the Shirley community has an annual event. And this year, one of the events was going to be a Shirley Temple Storybook themed tea party. Of course, it didn't happen because COVID-19 and the whole world stopped. But as we were planning for it, this was going to be my costume for it. I must thank Dave Kelleher. Some of you know him as Crofty. I gave Dave a simple green dress, and he turned it into, you probably can't see it in all of its glory, an exquisite replica of one of the costumes that Shirley wore as Ozma. She did not look the way Ozma looks in the book with the poppies and the Oz. This was her take on it, and her take became the basis for what I'm wearing today. Right down to the crown, also provided by Dave. If you don't know Dave, he is awesome, and I thank him for this outfit. We'll talk more about Shirley and the Land of Oz later on. Before we move to the presentation, the slideshow presentation, I want to do a little bit of a show and tell. In 2014, Shirley died, and the year after, her family, per her wishes, auctioned off the costumes, the dolls, the personal memorabilia that she'd kept in her collection all her life. And I attended those auctions. Ultimately, there were 3 of them. Like an Oz collector, hoping to get a little piece of Shirley. And at the first auction, I got a very little piece of Shirley, a press book. And then at the second auction, I got something that I'm really pretty proud of. And I'm going to take a moment to bring it over, if I can. Tech not being my strong suit. But this, I call this my Shirley Dorothy dress. This is a dress that Shirley Temple wore. This is a dress that Shirley Temple owned. Of course, I wanted it because it looked like Dorothy's dress. It wasn't Dorothy's dress, of course, but it was something that connected my 2 favorites. Shirley did not wear this in a film. Shirley wore it in publicity stills. She wore it in her personal life, and she wore it on the set of The Bluebird, which, we'll talk about this later, many refer to as Fox's answer to the Wizard of Oz. But we know, because of those pictures and the dates associated with those pictures, that she wore this in 1939. The earliest date, I believe, is February or March, and she wore it as late as September of 1939. And so while it's not, and could never be, because I certainly couldn't afford it, the Judy Garland screen wore gingham pinafore from The Wizard of Oz, it's as close to it as I'm going to get. And it also has special meaning for me because it's Shirley's. Thank you for tuning in to this part of our presentation. I'm going to stop the video, and a separate video will pick up with the narrated PowerPoint. And the good thing about the video presentations and the virtual presentations is, if you're not interested, you can just press stop. If you are interested, you can tune in. And if you just want to peruse, you can always fast forward. But I do thank you for tuning in and for allowing me to be part of To Oz. See you soon. Bye-bye.